The alarm on my console screamed before I even understood what it meant. Red light filled the chamber. Every screen around me flashed the same word, over and over, in a language older than my grandmother's grandmother. Return, return, return. I remember gripping the edge of my station so hard that my fingers ached. Outside the viewport, the sky above the human world was burning with light that should not have existed. Ships that should have taken decades to build were moving like they had always been there. And somewhere behind me, in a chamber I had once mocked, an old voice was saying words I finally understood. We were warned. My name is HFY, and I was a junior archivist for the Interstellar Concord, the great alliance of civilized worlds that had existed for longer than most species could count. I want to tell you what happened, not because I am proud of what I did, but because someone has to remember it correctly. The historians will get it wrong. They always do. So I am telling you myself, from the beginning, before the fire, before the silence, before we understood what we had done. It began on an ordinary day in the Concord Assembly Hall, a place built from living crystal that hummed faintly with the voices of 10,000 years of debate. I was young then, barely finished with my training, sitting in the observation tier where junior members were allowed to watch but never speak. The assembly was discussing a small, unimportant world at the edge of known space, a blue and green planet, third from a yellow star, home to a species that had only just discovered how to leave their own atmosphere. Humans. I had read the reports. Everyone had. A species barely out of its own childhood, still fighting among themselves over borders and beliefs, still burning fuel from the ground to fly their machines. By every measure the Concord used, they were primitive, charming, in the way a child's drawing is charming. Nothing more. That was when the elders spoke. The elders were the oldest members of the Concord, representatives of a generation that had lived through something none of us fully understood. They rarely appeared in the assembly anymore. Most of them stayed in the deep archive towers, silent, watching star charts scroll past for centuries at a time. So when three of them entered the hall together, wrapped in robes the color of old ash, the entire chamber went quiet. The eldest of them, a being named Torel Ashran, stepped forward. Her voice was thin, but it carried to every corner of the hall without effort. "Do not open contact with this world," she said. "Do not offer them your knowledge. Do not draw their attention." Someone in the lower tier laughed. I remember that laugh because it was the loudest sound in the room, and because I almost joined in. A representative from the Trade Council, a tall being with silver eyes, asked the question everyone was thinking. "Elder Ashran, with respect, why would a species that cannot yet leave its own solar system be a threat to anyone?" Torel Ashran did not answer right away. She looked around the room slowly, at each of us, as if she were trying to memorize our faces before something changed them forever. "They do not fear the way you fear," she finally said. "They do not stop the way you stop. If you wake them, you had better be ready to never sleep again." It sounded like poetry. It sounded like the kind of warning old people give young people about things they no longer understand. I remember thinking, with the arrogance only the young truly possess, that the elders had simply lived too long, that they had seen too many wars in their early centuries and now saw danger in everything, even a species too small to matter. The vote happened anyway. Contact was approved, 312 votes to 9. The 9 votes against were, of course, the elders and a handful of their oldest allies. Everyone else wanted to see what humans were like. Everyone else wanted to be the one who discovered them. I volunteered for the first contact team. I told myself it was for the honor of my family name. The truth is simpler. I was curious, and curiosity has always been the thing that gets young people killed. The journey to their world took 11 days at Concord speed, which would have taken humans several lifetimes with their own technology. I spent most of that time reading everything the scout drones had gathered. Their history was full of conflict, yes, but it was also full of something I had never seen described so clearly in any other species. They kept fighting even when the numbers said they should not. They kept building even when their own world tried to kill them with storms and cold and disease. There was a phrase one of their old poets had written, something about not going gently, that I read over and over, without understanding why it stayed in my mind. We landed in a wide green field outside a city called Den Hollow, chosen because human scientists there had already been in careful, limited communication with our scout probes for several months. I stepped out of the ship first, because I was young and foolish and wanted to be remembered as the one who took the first step. A woman was waiting for us. Her name was Laura Bennett, and she was the lead scientist assigned to our arrival. She did not look afraid. She did not look amazed either, not in the way I expected. She looked at me the way you look at a puzzle you have already started solving in your head. "You're smaller than I thought you'd be," she said, which was not the greeting I had prepared for. I laughed, actually laughed, and something in her expression softened. That was the first human laugh I ever caused, and for a long time I was proud of it. The following weeks were filled with meetings, exchanges, careful diplomatic dances. Humans asked questions constantly, more than any species I had studied. They wanted to know how our ships worked, how our medicine healed wounds in minutes instead of weeks, how our translators turned every language into something they could understand instantly. At first I found this endearing, a young species eager to learn. Then I began to notice the pattern. They were not just curious, they were absorbing everything, faster than any of our own scholars would have predicted. A young engineer named Peter Hale asked me one afternoon to explain the basic principle behind our shield generators. I explained it in simple terms, expecting him to nod politely and move on. Instead, he asked 3 more questions, each one sharper than the last, each one aimed directly at the parts of the technology that mattered most. I mentioned this to my superior, a Concord officer named Doran Ilsk. He waved it away. "They are children with good questions," he said. Nothing more. I wanted to believe him. I really did. The first sign of trouble came 6 months into our presence on their world. A group of raiders, a small criminal faction that operated in the unclaimed space near the human system, attacked one of their orbital stations. It was a minor station, mostly used for research, home to perhaps 40 people. Under Concord Protocol, in situations like this, the correct response was to alert the nearest patrol fleet and wait for authorized forces to respond. It was the safe way, the proper way, the way that had kept the peace among 100 species for 10,000 years. Humans did not wait. I was in Den Hollow when the news reached us, standing in a control room with Laura Bennett and a Concord liaison named Ren Ostavi. The moment the distress call came through, before Ren could even finish suggesting we contact the regional patrol fleet, a woman on the other side of the room, a station commander named Grace Winters, was already issuing orders. Ships that had been meant for cargo transport were being fitted with weapons in real time. Pilots who had trained for atmospheric flight were being briefed on combat maneuvers they had never officially practiced. Ren Ostavi tried to explain that this was not the correct procedure, that patience and proper channels would resolve the situation with fewer losses. Grace Winters looked at him with an expression I did not have a word for yet, though I would come to know it very well over the following years. "With respect," she said, 40 of our people are up there right now, and you're telling me to wait for someone else to save them." The rescue happened 11 hours later. It should not have worked. By every calculation our tacticians ran afterward, the human ships were outmatched, undertrained, and operating with equipment that was, by Concord standards, embarrassingly outdated. And yet they succeeded. Not cleanly, not without cost, but they succeeded, driving the raiders away and recovering every survivor from the station. I watched the recordings later, alone, in my quarters. What struck me was not the outcome. It was the way the humans moved during the crisis. There was no hesitation in their decisions, no pause to weigh acceptable losses against strategic value, the way Concord commanders were trained to do. They simply acted, adjusted, and acted again, faster than the situation could change beneath them. I brought this to Doran Ilsk again. This time he did not wave it away so quickly. "It is impressive," he admitted, "but impressive is not the same as dangerous." I wanted to agree with him, I truly did. But that night, for the first time since arriving on their world, I found myself thinking about Terrell Ashrin's warning. They do not stop the way you stop. A few weeks later, the elders sent a formal message to the assembly, repeating their original caution, this time with more urgency. I read the transcript during a quiet evening in Den Hollow, sitting on a balcony that overlooked the city lights, a view I had grown fond of despite myself. "We are not warning you that humans are cruel," the message read. "We are warning you that they do not know how to lose gracefully, and one day someone will teach them what it feels like to be cornered." The assembly debated the message for exactly one session before dismissing it as excessive caution. The rescue at the station was already being celebrated across a dozen worlds as proof that humans were valuable allies, brave and capable, worth welcoming fully into the Concord. I remember Laura Bennett asking me, on one of our long evening walks through the city, what the elders were so afraid of. I told her honestly that I did not know. She was quiet for a moment, watching the last light fade behind the towers of her city. "Maybe they're afraid because they remember what it's like to be like us," she said, "before they became whoever they are now." I laughed it off at the time. I told her that was a very human thing to say, poetic but unproven. She smiled and did not argue, but something in her eyes told me she believed it more than she was saying. Looking back now, with everything I know, I think she was closer to the truth than any member of the assembly ever managed to be. But at the time, all I felt was the excitement of discovery, the thrill of standing at the edge of something new, and the quiet, growing unease of a warning I still did not fully understand. I had no idea how soon I would understand it completely. The months that followed felt, for a while, like the beginning of something wonderful. Trade routes opened between human space and a dozen Concord worlds. Students from Den Hollow and other human cities were accepted into Concord academies, eager to learn languages and sciences that had taken other species centuries to develop. I watched young humans absorb decades of Concord mathematics in a matter of months, not because they were naturally more intelligent than any other species, but because they seemed incapable of accepting the idea that something was simply too difficult to learn quickly. I spent much of that time working alongside Laura Bennett on a joint research project, studying the long-term effects of Concord medical technology on human biology. It was slow, careful work, and I found myself enjoying it more than I expected. Laura had a way of asking questions that cut straight past politeness into the heart of a problem. She once asked me, quite directly, why the Concord had waited so long to make contact with newer species at all. "We move carefully," I told her. "Contact changes everything for a young civilization. We prefer to let species mature before altering their path." "Convenient," she said. "That maturity always seems to mean becoming more like the Concord." I did not have a good answer for that. I still do not. During those months, I also began spending time with a small group of humans outside of official duties, mostly out of curiosity about how they lived when no one from the Concord was watching. There was Henry Cole, a quiet engineer who spoke more with his hands than his voice, always tinkering with some small machine, even during casual conversation. There was Nathan Price, a former soldier turned instructor, who taught close combat techniques at the local academy and who treated every training session, no matter how small, as if it truly mattered. There was Claire Doyle, a historian who reminded me, more than once, of the elders themselves, careful and thoughtful, always searching for patterns others missed. It was Claire who first pointed out something that unsettled me deeply. "You know," she said one evening over a simple meal in her small apartment, "your Concord has been around for 10,000 years, and it has never fought a war against an equal." I told her that was not entirely true, that there had been conflicts in the Concord's early history, before unification. "Sure," she said, "but not for a very long time. Every conflict since then has been against species less advanced than you, or crime, or accidents. You've never actually been tested by something that could hurt you back and refuse to stop." I remember feeling a chill at those words, though I could not have explained why at the time. I changed the subject, and Claire let me, though I noticed the small, knowing look she exchanged with Henry across the table. It was around this time that the first serious diplomatic tension emerged, not with raiders or criminals, but with a neighboring Concord species called the Vel, an old and proud people who had long controlled trade routes near human space. The Vel had grown resentful of how quickly humans were establishing new trade agreements that cut into routes the Vel had profited from for centuries. What began as sharp words in assembly sessions slowly escalated into something colder. A Vel trade convoy, without official authorization, began blockading a route used almost exclusively by human cargo ships. It was framed, officially, as a resource dispute, a matter for careful negotiation. Ren Ostavi, ever the proper diplomat, assured everyone that the Concord would resolve the matter through established channels within a few months. Grace Winters, who by then had been promoted to oversee human defense coordination for the region, did not wait a few months. She gave the Vel exactly 2 weeks to lift the blockade voluntarily. I was present at the meeting where she delivered this message, standing quietly at the edge of the room alongside Ren Ostavi, who looked as though he had swallowed something bitter. The Vel delegate, a tall, elegant being named Corvath Sel, laughed openly at her demand. "You have 2 weeks to reconsider," Grace Winters repeated, her voice calm and level. "After that, we will consider other options." Corvath Sel dismissed her without another word. "I want to be honest about what happened next, because I think it is the moment the entire Concord should have paid closer attention to, long before things grew far worse. When the 2 weeks ended and the blockade remained, human forces did not launch a full assault, as many in the assembly feared and quietly hoped they might, giving the Concord an excuse to condemn them. Instead, over the course of a single night, human engineers and pilots executed a precise, coordinated operation that disabled the blockading ship's engines and weapons systems without a single fatality on either side. By morning, the blockade was gone, the Vel convoy was drifting harmlessly, and not one life had been lost. It should have reassured everyone. Instead, it terrified them, because it proved something far more unsettling than aggression ever could have. It proved restraint. It proved that humans were capable of overwhelming force and had chosen, deliberately, to use exactly enough and no more. That kind of control, that kind of discipline paired with speed, was something the Concord had never encountered in a species so young. Doran Ilsk called me into his office the following day. He looked tired in a way I had not seen before, the kind of tired that came from realizing you had underestimated something important. "I owe you an apology, Ashen," he said. "You raised concerns months ago, and I dismissed them. I should not have." I told him I did not fully understand what had changed his mind. He gestured toward a data screen showing the tactical analysis of the previous night's operation. "They planned for outcomes we did not even consider possible," he said, "and they executed that plan with a level of coordination that took our own strategists years to develop. If they can do this now, barely a year after first contact, I am afraid to imagine what they will be capable of in a decade." I asked him what he thought we should do. "Listen to the elders," he said quietly, "before it is too late to listen at all." For the first time since the Assembly's original vote, I found myself agreeing completely. The message reached the Assembly within days, carried by officials who could no longer dismiss what they had witnessed. Terrell Ashrin stood once more before the full chamber, and this time, no one laughed. "I told you," she said simply. "I did not want to be right." The Assembly voted to establish new protocols for managing relations with human space, protocols designed to slow the pace of technological exchange and limit human involvement in Concord military coordination. It was, in hindsight, far too little, offered far too late, wrapped in the same careful, hesitant language the Concord had always used when facing something it did not fully understand. Because the truth none of us wanted to admit yet, was that humans had already learned everything they needed to learn. The restraint they had shown against the Vel was not a limit on what they were capable of. It was a choice, and choices, unlike limits, can always be reconsidered. I did not know it then, standing in that chamber and finally believing the elders' warning, but the real test was still ahead of us. The Vel blockade had been a disagreement between allies, resolved without true violence. What came next would not be so gentle, and it would not be humans who started it. It would be us. Before that day arrived, though, there was a quieter season, one I find myself returning to often when I try to remember why so many of us wanted so badly to believe humans were simply eager friends, rather than something we did not yet have the vocabulary to describe. It lasted almost a full year, and during that year I came closer to understanding the ordinary rhythms of human life than any Concord representative before me. I was assigned, alongside Laura Bennett, to a cultural exchange program meant to strengthen ties between our peoples away from the pressure of formal diplomacy. It was Doran Ilsk's idea, born from his belief that understanding a species required more than studying its weapons and its councils. He wanted us to understand how humans spent their ordinary hours, what they valued when no one from the Concord was watching, what made them laugh and what made them grow quiet. I moved into a small residence on the edge of Den Hollow, in a neighborhood filled with families, markets, and the kind of noise that never seemed to fully stop, even late into the night. At first, the constant motion unsettled me. Concord cities, even the busiest of them, carried a certain measured calm, a sense that everything had its place and its proper time. Den Hollow felt like it was always slightly ahead of itself, always reaching towards something not yet finished. I spent mornings with Henry Cole in his small workshop, watching him repair machines that, by Concord standards, should have been replaced years earlier. He explained once, while adjusting a stubborn engine component with tools that looked almost primitive to me, that humans had a saying about not fixing what was not broken, and an equally strong instinct to fix things long after most species would have simply discarded them. "We don't like waste," he told me, wiping grease from his hands with a cloth that had clearly seen better days. "Not because we're poor, because we remember being poor, all of us, somewhere in our history. It doesn't leave you, even after it's gone." I found myself thinking about that conversation often in later years, long after Ashgrove, long after everything changed. It explained, in its own small way, why humans never seemed to discard a grievance either, no matter how much time passed or how many apologies were offered. In the evenings, I would often join Claire Doyle at gatherings held in the university's old lecture halls, where scholars debated everything from ancient human history to the ethics of Concord medicine, arguments that grew loud and passionate in a way Concord academic discourse never permitted. I remember being startled the first time I watched two respected historians shout at each other over a disagreement about a war fought centuries earlier, only to see them share a meal together afterward as though nothing had happened at all. "You argue and then you forgive easily," I said to Claire one evening, genuinely puzzled by the pattern. Among my people, disagreement of that intensity would end a friendship for years, if not forever. Claire considered this for a long moment before answering. "That's because you've never had to rely on people you disagree with to survive a hard winter," she said. "We learned a long time ago that being right about an argument matters less than being able to trust the person next to you when something actually threatens you both." I did not fully appreciate the weight of that statement until much later, when I watched humans set aside their own internal disagreements again and again in moments of true crisis, uniting instantly around whatever threatened them most, only to return just as quickly to their arguments once the danger had passed. It was, I came to believe, one of the most misunderstood aspects of their nature. Outsiders often mistook their constant internal disagreement for weakness, for division that could be exploited. It was, in truth, closer to a kind of exercise, a way of keeping their instincts sharp for the moments that mattered most. Nathan Price, during this same period, invited me several times to observe his training sessions at the academy, an offer I initially found unsettling, given my discomfort with anything resembling combat instruction. I accepted eventually, mostly out of professional curiosity, and found myself surprised by what I witnessed. The sessions were not about aggression, not primarily. They were about endurance, about teaching young humans to keep functioning clearly, even when exhausted, even when frightened, even when every instinct told them to stop. "You cannot train someone to be brave," Nathan told me once. watching a group of exhausted trainees complete one final exercise long after most of them clearly wanted to quit. But you can train them to keep moving after the fear arrives instead of before it. That's really all courage is. Everyone is afraid. We just don't let the fear finish the sentence for us. I wrote that phrase down in my personal notes that evening, not fully understanding why it felt important. I understand now. It was, in its own quiet way, the entire explanation for everything that followed. Humans were not fearless. They had simply built an entire culture around refusing to let fear be the final word in any story they were part of. It was during this same peaceful season that I began noticing something else, something smaller and stranger than anything the tactical reports had captured. Humans, I realized, had an extraordinary capacity for kindness towards strangers, a trait that seemed almost contradictory given everything else I had learned about their history of conflict. I watched Laura Bennett spend an entire evening helping an elderly neighbor she barely knew repair a broken irrigation system for a small garden, refusing any payment, treating the task as though it were simply what neighbors did for one another. I watched Peter Hale organize a small group of engineering students to rebuild a playground destroyed by a storm, working through 2 full nights without complaint. I asked Laura once why kindness and conflict seemed to live so easily side by side within her people, expecting some complicated philosophical answer. She simply shrugged. "We know how fast things can go wrong," she said. "Maybe that's exactly why we try so hard to be good to each other while things are still going right." I carried that thought with me into the darker years that followed, and I have never fully let it go, even now. It is, I believe, the piece of humanity that the wider galaxy understood the least, and the piece that made everything else about them so difficult to categorize. A species capable of both extraordinary gentleness and extraordinary resolve, often within the very same day, sometimes within the very same hour. The peaceful season ended, as all such seasons eventually do, not because humans changed, but because the galaxy around them finally showed its true face. 6 months after the Vel incident, an event occurred that the Concord, even now, struggles to speak about honestly. I was stationed on Den Hollow at the time, continuing joint research with Laura Bennett, when a distress signal reached the human colony of Ashgrove, a modest settlement of nearly 200,000 people established on a moon within their own solar system, populated largely by families, teachers, farmers, ordinary people building ordinary lives far from any battlefield. The signal came from a Concord enforcement vessel, the kind used to patrol resource claims across contested space. According to official records recovered later, the vessel's commander, an officer named Vesk Tran, believed Ashgrove had been established in violation of an old, largely forgotten resource treaty, one signed centuries before humans had even developed powered flight, granting certain mineral rights to a long-dissolved mining consortium. I have read every version of what happened next, official and unofficial, and I still cannot fully explain the decision that followed. Vesk Tran, acting without direct authorization from the Assembly, ordered his vessel to disable Ashgrove's primary shield generator as a show of force, intending, according to his own later testimony, only to demonstrate Concord authority and force a diplomatic resolution. The generator failure caused a cascading power collapse across the colony's life support systems. Within hours, large sections of Ashgrove lost heating, atmospheric processing, and emergency medical support. By the time backup systems stabilized the situation, 183 people had died, most of them from exposure in the moon's brutal night cycle, many of them children. I remember exactly where I was when the news reached me. I was sitting with Laura Bennett in her small university office, reviewing research data, when her communicator activated with a message she was not authorized to ignore. I watched her face change as she read it, watched the color drain from her expression entirely. She did not cry. I want to be honest about that because it surprised me at the time. She simply became very still, very quiet, and asked me to leave the room. I did not understand, not fully, until later that night, when the full scale of what had happened reached every human news channel simultaneously. Names of the dead, ages of the dead, photographs of families who would never be whole again. I sat alone in my quarters and watched the human world change in real time, watched grief transform, hour by hour, into something colder and far more dangerous. The Concord Assembly convened an emergency session within a day. Vesk Tran was immediately relieved of command and placed under investigation. Official statements of regret were issued. Compensation was formally offered. Ren Ostavi personally traveled to Ashgrove to deliver the Concord's apology in person, a gesture I believe he made with genuine sorrow. It was not enough. It could never have been enough. Grace Winters, who I had come to respect deeply over the previous year, addressed the Human Government's Emergency Council in a broadcast that reached every corner of their world, and through translation networks, every corner of Concord space as well. I watched it standing beside Doran Ilsk, both of us silent, both of us understanding that we were witnessing something that could not be undone. "We do not seek war," she said, her voice steady despite everything. "We are not asking for revenge. We are asking for something simple. Never again will anyone treat our children as acceptable losses in a dispute over minerals from a treaty signed before our great-grandparents were born. If the Concord cannot guarantee our safety, we will guarantee it ourselves." Doran Ilsk turned to me after the broadcast ended, his expression grave. "That is not a declaration of war," he said quietly. "That is worse. That is a declaration of intent." I asked him what he meant. "They are not angry anymore," he said. "They have moved past anger into something far more organized. Anger fades. This will not." In the days immediately following the disaster, before any military response had even been planned, I watched something else unfold across human space that the official histories rarely mention. Ordinary people from cities and towns that had no connection to Ashgrove at all began organizing relief efforts within hours of the news breaking. Supply ships loaded with medical equipment, blankets, and food departed from a dozen different human worlds before any government had even issued a formal request for aid. Henry Cole, when I finally reached him by communicator days later, told me he had spent every waking hour since the disaster helping coordinate volunteer engineers traveling to Ashgrove to assist with the rebuilding of essential infrastructure. "We don't wait to be told to help each other," he said, his voice rough with exhaustion. "That's not something you order people to do. It just happens." I found this detail more unsettling, in its own way, than anything the tactical reports later described about the Mineral Consortium's dismantling. A species capable of mobilizing grief into organized compassion that quickly, without central command, without hesitation, was a species capable of mobilizing anything else it chose to focus its attention on with the very same speed. Doran Ilsk pointed this out to me himself, during one of our last conversations before he was reassigned to a different sector entirely. "Watch what they build as closely as you watch what they destroy," he told me. "The speed is the same either way. That is what should concern us most." I did not fully understand his meaning until 3 weeks later, when human forces, without any formal declaration through Concord channels, arrived at the outer edge of the resource claim that had triggered the original disaster and systematically dismantled every remaining asset connected to the long-dissolved mining consortium, asset by asset, with a precision that left no ambiguity about their capability or their intent. No lives were lost in that operation. That fact was noted carefully by human officials in every statement afterward, a deliberate signal that this was not chaos, not blind vengeance, but something far more unsettling: control. Humans had shown, once again, that when they chose restraint, it was a choice, and choices could be revisited whenever they decided the situation demanded it. I traveled to Ashgrove myself, several weeks after the disaster, part of a small Concord delegation sent to assess the long-term needs of the colony's recovery. I had not expected to see Nathan Price there, working alongside local rescue teams, his usual calm demeanor replaced by something harder, something focused entirely on the task in front of him rather than any conversation around it. He recognized me immediately and did not pretend to be friendly the way he once had. "You wanted to understand us," he said, standing amid the wreckage of a building that had once been a school. "Here it is. This is what happens when someone decides our lives are a line item in an old agreement." I told him honestly that I grieved for what had happened, that I had never wanted this outcome any more than he had. "I believe you," he said, "but belief does not rebuild a school, Ashen, and it does not bring back the people who never got to grow up." I had no response to that. I still do not. It was during that visit that I finally understood, completely and without any remaining doubt, what Terrell Ashran had been trying to warn us about from the very beginning. Humans were not dangerous because they were cruel. They were dangerous because they refused to accept loss as simply the cost of doing business among the stars. Every other species in the Concord had, over thousands of years, learned to absorb tragedy as an unfortunate but manageable part of galactic life. Treaties were signed, compensation was offered, life continued, carefully, cautiously, within the boundaries the Concord had spent millennia establishing. Humans had not yet learned that lesson, and after Ashgrove, I do not believe they ever intended to. The Assembly, in the months that followed, attempted to rebuild trust through increasingly desperate diplomatic gestures, offering humans a permanent seat on the Concord's highest governing council, an honor that had taken most member species centuries to earn. It was, I believe, a sincere attempt at reconciliation. It was also, I have come to understand, far too little, arriving only after the true cost of underestimating humanity had already been paid in full. Grace Winters accepted the seat on behalf of human space, but her acceptance speech, delivered before the full assembly, contained a line that I have never forgotten, a line that Terrell Ashran later told me she considered the truest thing any species representative had said in the Concord's entire history. "We will sit at your table," Grace Winters said, "but understand this clearly. We did not join you because we needed your protection. We joined you because we have decided, for now, that peace is worth more to us than being alone. That decision can change. Please do not give us a reason to change it again." I looked around the chamber as she spoke and saw something I had never witnessed there before: fear, quiet and unspoken, on the faces of representatives from species far older, far more powerful by every traditional measure than the small blue and green world humanity called home. The elders had warned us that humans did not stop the way we stopped. Ashgrove taught the entire galaxy exactly what that meant, and by the time the lesson was fully understood, there was no undoing what had already been set in motion. In the years that followed Ashgrove, something shifted permanently across Concord space, something I felt long before I fully understood its shape. Humanity's presence in the assembly grew steadily, not through conquest, not through demands, but through something far more difficult to resist: competence. Every crisis they were asked to help resolve, they resolved faster and more efficiently than established protocol allowed for. Every technology they were given, they improved within months. Every treaty they signed, they honored completely, and every treaty broken against them, they answered with a precision that left no room for argument about proportionality. I remained close with Laura Bennett throughout this period, watching her career grow alongside her people's rising influence. She was eventually appointed to a senior advisory role within the Concord Science Division, one of the first humans ever granted authority over research affecting multiple member species. I asked her once, during a quiet dinner in her new offices on a Concord station orbiting a distant gas giant, whether she ever worried about how quickly her people had risen. She considered the question carefully before answering, which was very much like her. "I worry about it every single day," she said. "Not because I think we'll misuse it, because I've read enough history, yours and ours, to know that power always finds a way to change the people who hold it, whether they intend to let it or not." I asked her what she thought could prevent that. "Remembering Ashgrove," she said simply. "As long as we remember what it cost us to be taken seriously, we'll be careful with what that seriousness allows us to do." I found comfort in her answer at the time. I am less certain now, looking back, whether comfort was the right thing to feel. The true turning point, the moment historians across 100 worlds now mark as the beginning of the era we live in today, came nearly 4 years after first contact, when a coalition of older Concord species, led quietly by remnants of the Vel faction, still resentful over the earlier blockade incident, attempted something no one believed possible. They conspired, in secret, to engineer a controlled crisis within human space itself, hoping to fracture humanity's growing unity by exploiting old political divisions that still existed among different human nations. I learned of the plot almost by accident, through a conversation overheard between two Vel officials during a diplomatic reception on Den Hollow, a conversation they assumed no one nearby could understand, not realizing I had spent years perfecting my knowledge of their dialect, specifically to better serve as a liaison. What I heard chilled me in a way nothing since Ashgrove had managed to. They intended to quietly supply advanced weaponry to a small separatist faction within human territory, a group that had long argued for full independence from the larger human government, hoping to spark an internal conflict that would consume humanity's attention and slow their rising influence within the Concord indefinitely. I did not know what to do with this information at first. Reporting it through official Concord channels risked years of investigation while the plot continued uninterrupted. I made a decision that night that I have never regretted, though it changed the course of my entire life. I contacted Laura Bennett directly and told her everything I had heard. She did not panic. She thanked me, calmly, and asked me to say nothing further to anyone until she had spoken with the appropriate people within her own government. I did not learn the full details of what happened next for several months, pieced together slowly from fragments of information that eventually became public record. Human intelligence services, working with a precision that startled even the Concord's most experienced investigators, identified every individual involved in the weapons smuggling operation within days of receiving my information. Rather than launching a direct confrontation, which might have triggered exactly the internal conflict the Vel conspirators hoped for, human authorities allowed the operation to continue under careful surveillance, gathering complete evidence of Vel involvement while quietly reinforcing the separatist faction's community with economic support and open dialogue, addressing the very grievances that had made them vulnerable to outside manipulation in the first place. When the operation finally concluded, the separatist movement had been resolved peacefully, its concerns formally addressed within human governance, and the Vel conspirators responsible for the plot were presented before the full Concord Assembly with evidence so complete and so damning that no defense was possible. I was present in the chamber the day Grace Winters addressed the Assembly regarding the conspiracy. I expected anger. I expected, honestly, some form of retaliation that would finally confirm every fear the elders had originally expressed. Instead, she delivered something far more unsettling in its calm precision. "You tried to divide us by exploiting our own disagreements," she said, addressing the Vel delegation directly. "It did not work, because unlike some of you, we have learned that our disagreements are meant to make us stronger, not weaker. We will not retaliate against your people as a whole for the actions of a few who acted without your government's full authorization. But those individuals will face human justice for the lives their weapons would have cost, and the Concord will formally acknowledge, on record, exactly what was attempted here today." The Vel government, faced with undeniable evidence and the very real possibility of losing their standing within the Concord entirely, agreed to every demand without argument. The individuals responsible were extradited to human territory, tried under a joint Concord human legal framework established specifically for the occasion, and sentenced accordingly. It was, by every measure available, the most controlled, most measured response imaginable to an act of genuine betrayal. And yet, sitting in that chamber, watching the calm certainty with which Grace Winters handled a crisis that could have justified almost any response she chose, I understood something that I do not believe I could have articulated so clearly even a year earlier. Humans had not simply become powerful. They had become patient, and patience, paired with the kind of capability they had already demonstrated, was infinitely more dangerous than anger ever could have been. I sought out Terrell Ashran after that session, finding her in the quiet archive tower where she spent most of her remaining time. I asked her directly whether this outcome, this careful, measured resolution, meant that her original warning had perhaps been mistaken after all. She was quiet for a long moment before answering, her ancient eyes fixed on the star charts, scrolling silently across the wall of her chamber. "My warning was never that humans would destroy us," she said finally. "My warning was that once they understood their own strength completely, the rest of us would have no choice but to become better, or become irrelevant. Today you watch them choose to become better while remaining strong. That should frighten you far more than if they had simply chosen violence." I asked her why. "Because violence ends," she said. "Discipline does not." I did not fully understand her meaning that day, though I would come to understand it completely in the years that followed, as humanity's role within the Concord grew from cautious new member to genuine pillar of galactic stability, respected and, yes, still quietly feared by nearly every species who remembered how close that respect had come to never existing at all. The final piece of this story, the piece that brought me back to that burning sky I described at the very beginning, arrived almost a decade after first contact, when a threat none of us had anticipated emerged from far beyond even Concord space, an ancient, hostile intelligence that had remained dormant in the deep unclaimed regions between galaxies for longer than any recorded civilization had existed. When that threat finally revealed itself, attacking a distant Concord outpost with a level of destructive capability that reduced even our most advanced defenses to wreckage within hours, it was human forces, alongside a coalition they themselves had helped organize among younger Concord species, who arrived first, who adapted fastest, and who ultimately devised the strategy that turned an unstoppable enemy back into the darkness from which it came. I stood beside Laura Bennett on the bridge of a joint command vessel during the final hours of that engagement, watching Daniel Grant, by then a senior human commander respected across every corner of Concord space, coordinate a defense that should not have been possible given the resources available to us. When the enemy finally retreated, when the burning sky I remembered so vividly finally began to quiet, I turned to Laura and asked her the question I had carried with me since that very first day in the assembly hall. "Do you think the elders regret warning us?" I asked, "given everything your people have become?" She smiled, tired but genuine, watching the wreckage of a battle her people had helped win drift silently past the viewport. "I think," she said, "they regret that no one listened sooner, not because we needed permission to become who we are, but because a decade of misunderstanding cost lives on both sides that never needed to be lost." I thought of Ashgrove then, of the school Nathan Price had stood in among the wreckage, of every warning dismissed as paranoia, every caution ignored in favor of curiosity and convenience. I thought of Terrell Ashran's tired eyes, carrying the weight of a warning she had given exactly right, and had still watched go unheeded until the cost became unbearable. I visited Terrell Ashran one final time before her passing, many years after that burning sky had finally settled into quiet. She was very old by then, even by the standards of her own long-lived people, and she spent most of her remaining days in the same archive tower where I had first sought her out for answers. I asked her, honestly, whether she believed the Concord had learned anything at all from everything that had happened. She smiled, a small tired thing, and gestured toward the star chart still scrolling silently across her chamber wall, decades of galactic history compressed into quiet, endless light. "We learned to listen a little faster the second time," she said. "That is not nothing. It is simply not enough, and it will never be enough, because every generation believes its own certainty is different from the certainty that came before it. Humans taught us that patience and strength are not opposites. I hope, when the next warning comes, whoever hears it remembers that lesson before they need it, rather than after." I asked her if she had any regret about the warning she had given all those years ago, standing before an assembly that had laughed at her. "None," she said. "Only regret for how long it took to be believed." I left her chamber that day carrying those words with me the way I carry them still, and I think of them often when I watch new species enter the Concord now, wide-eyed and eager, certain that they understand exactly what they are stepping into. I think of them when I watch young Concord officials dismiss old warnings as the anxious imagination of elders who have simply lived too long. I think of them most of all when I remember Laura Bennett's voice on the night Ashgrove burned, quiet and still, grieving in a way that would soon become something the entire galaxy learned to respect and to fear in equal measure. We were warned, clearly, patiently, more than once, by people who had seen enough of the galaxy to know exactly what they were describing. We chose not to listen, not because the warning was unclear, but because it was inconvenient, because curiosity and ambition are always louder than caution when the danger has not yet arrived at your own door. I do not know what the next chapter of this story will bring. Humanity's influence continues to grow, steady and deliberate, and I have long since stopped believing that growth will ever slow. What I do know, what I have carried with me every day since that burning sky first taught me the true meaning of the Elder's words, is this. The next time someone tells you a warning sounds like an old story, told by people who have simply lived too long and seen too much, listen anyway. Sometimes the people who have seen too much are the only ones who truly understand what is coming. We were warned about humans. We did not listen until it was too late to matter. And now, all any of us can do, human and conquered alike, is make certain that the next warning, whatever form it takes and whoever delivers it, does not meet the same fate as the first.